Hello, my name is John Horgan. I am an occasional science correspondent for Blogging Heads TV, and I have a very special guest today with me, the psychologist Sheldon Solomon, and we are going to talk about his wonderful new book. Um, let's see, I'm just holding a copy of it up here, The Worm at the Core. But first, Sheldon, could you just briefly introduce yourself for the Blogging Heads audience?
Certainly, John. My name's Sheldon Solomon, and I'm happy to be here. I teach psychology at Skidmore College in Saratoga Springs, New York.
Uh-huh. All right. And I'm curious about your background. Could you just tell me when and why you became a psychologist in the first place?
Yes, I'm happy to do that, John, although it's not a very, well, it's a kind of a counterintuitive, perhaps, tale. I was an undergraduate at Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, back in the 1970s, and I thought I was a pre-med student, a chemistry major. In fact, I was, and I didn't like chemistry all that much. And so at the end of my second year, my roommate at the time was a psychology major, and he had the books for introductory psychology. And I thought, well, I'll just do that because I'll save money on books. And so now, in fairness, the minute I got into the class, I was like, oh, this is pretty cool because they didn't have psychology in high school back in the old days. And so the idea that you could actually, go to college to think about why people do things, and that moreover, you could use the scientific method to systematically test your hunches about why people behave the way they do. I thought that was great. But my old timer joke is that if my buddy was a plumber, that's what I'd be doing today.
Well, I don't know. Sometimes the choice between an honest trade like plumbing or being an electrician and academia, who knows? That could be a tough choice.
There you go.
So I'm curious, what was the dominant paradigm in psychology when you were an undergraduate? Was it behaviorism then, or was Freud still kicking around?
No, Freud was a dirty word, as was any talk about unconscious mental processes or even motivation, for that matter. So I kind of caught the end of behaviorism in transition to the so-called cognitive revolution, where people were likened to information processing machines. And for the most part, there was a heavy stress on empirical methods in the service of identifying how people incorporate information into their minds and then act accordingly.
Well, it's interesting you say that because I mean this as a compliment, but you seem to be a kind of old-fashioned psychologist, at least from reading your books. This is my takeaway. In the tradition of Freud and William James, more than the kind of mechanical behaviorists. I mean, even the title of your book, "The Worm at the Core," is taken from William James. Were you exposed to those folks, James and Freud, at all when you were an
No,
undergraduate?
not at all. So, although I was encouraged to think in motivational terms, so I would
Hmm.
say that the only thing that I had coming out of college was a devotion to empirical inquiry. Plus, I was lucky enough to have an advisor who was trained in the cognitive dissonance tradition, and Leon Festinger was well known for emphasizing motivational ideas. And of course, Festinger's mentor was Kurt Lewin or Kurt Lewin. And he's the psychologist who famously coined the phrase that there's nothing more useful than a good theory. So leaving college, I had a motivational orientation, and I had this idea based on the people who trained me that our job was to try and develop theories that were sufficiently grand in scope to account for as much of human affairs as possible.
Were there any psychologists whose empirical work was particularly impressive to you? I mean, what about somebody like Stanley Milgram, for example? Was he already famous in the 1970s?
Yes, absolutely. Milgram, very famous, but also, how shall I put this? A figure who generated immense ambivalence because, on the one hand, Milgram with the obedience studies, Zimbardo with the prison studies, people got the sense that here were folks that were studying in very realistic settings a phenomenon that were of tremendous import, and that was a good thing. On the other hand, they weren't very systematic researchers, and so what a lot of folks said is that yes, Milgram is important. He drew our attention to the extent to which regular people, would obey even ridiculous commands in certain situations. Zimbardo, the same thing. People can turn into what appear to be serial killing monsters if you put them in a prison guard uniform, but they weren't very rigorous in terms of their experimental designs, and so noteworthy, and we were influenced by them because we thought it was more important to think about what it is that you want to understand and worry about the laboratory part of it later. I mean, we were committed to testing hypotheses, but we thought the best place to find those hypotheses was to look around in the so-called real world and see what phenomenon interested us.
Uh, so when, you met your future co-authors in graduate school, and I guess that is also when you discovered the work of Ernest Becker. Could you
Well,
describe how that happened?
yes, certainly. Actually, Becker's a little bit later, but what happened is I went to the University of Kansas for a PhD program in experimental social psychology in 1975. Tom Pazinski came in 1976, and Jeff Greenberg came in 1977. And, we quickly realized that we were very compatible, both personally and professionally. Like a lot of guys at the time, we loved sports and we liked movies and we liked music and food and drink and so on. And that was a lot of fun, just getting to know them and to become close friends. But we also shared an affection for motivational theorizing. And then we had two questions that interested us at the time, but we thought they were very different questions. And so one question it goes back to William James, and that's how come people need self-esteem. James said in 1890 in the first book that called Psychology, arguably the first psychology book, that he thought self-esteem was so important to human beings that he put it right up there with basic emotions like anger and fear, but he didn't get very far in terms of understanding why it is that we need self-esteem and how it is that we acquire it and what psychological functions it serves and how it does that. So that was one thing that.
Can
Go ahead.
I just
Go ahead,
want,
John.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm just curious. The term self-esteem, did James actually use that? I associate it so much with our era.
Yeah. Well, I can either make something up or I better go back and check. I'm not sure
Okay.
that, you're right, because it may have been self-regard. Then Virginia Woolf in the 1920s in her essays, she calls it self-confidence, where she just says, without self-confidence, we are like babes in the cradle. I'm going to have to get back to you on that one, John, because
Okay.
I think that's a good question. I'm definitely guilty of injecting the present into the past because I use the word so frequently that I am attributing it to James, but I'm not sure now that you mention that. Good
When
point. Anyway, it was a big
mhm,
interest of social psychologists in the 1970s. That
mhm,
is, okay, why is it that we want to feel good about ourselves? And the prevailing view at the time was called impression management theory. And the idea was that we want to feel good about ourselves because our hope is that in so doing, other people will feel good about us. And Jeff and Tom and I did not dispute that, but we found that explanation profoundly unsatisfying. It just seemed to us that whatever self-esteem was, that there was more to it than just to manage the impressions that we make on other people.
mhm.
Um, so we used to sit around and during our intramural bowling on Fridays, and we'd be like, "Oh, there's got to be more to it than just managing impressions." And then the other question that we had, and this was from Jeff coming, The Last of Us. He had studied in his previous program at SMU, where he got his master's. He was interested in how come people can't get along with other people that are different, that look different, that worship different gods or salute different flags. And so in graduate school, those were our two questions. What's self-esteem and what does it do? And why can't we peacefully coexist with folks that don't share our beliefs about the nature of reality? And we did some, I think, very interesting experiments in both domains. But it was in 1980 when I finished my PhD and I got a job at Skidmore College, and I got my job under slightly false pretexts. Specifically, I came here for a job interview, and they said to me, "Oh, the position that we're interviewing you for is both in social psychology as well as personality theory." And I had never had a course in personality theory, and frankly, I didn't even know what it was. But being as I liked eating, I was like, and then they said, "Oh, can you do that?" And I was like, "Oh crap!" They didn't ask me if I knew anything about it, just if I could do it. So I'm like, "Oh yeah, of course, I'll teach nuclear physics too. Just give me a job." So I get a job, and it was literally, I think, September of 1980, and I'm kind of sprinting up and down the aisles in the library at Skidmore, and two things happened to me that turned out to be critical. One is that I noticed that Freud had written quite a bit, and that his collected works, literally, if you laid down next to them in the library, he wrote more than I was tall. And I
Wow.
was like, wow, for a guy that supposedly has nothing to say, this guy has written quite a bit. And so I decided that I would take a peek at what Freud was up to, starting with his introductory lectures on psychoanalysis. And I realized very quickly that although he did say a lot of stupid shit, if you'll pardon the expression, he also he thought about profoundly important questions in extremely interesting ways. And even if I just tore the page out of every book where I found him saying things that seemed to me to be silly, there was still a lot that remained. And so my affection for and interest in the kind of old timer psychodynamic people was a result of that relatively chance encounter. And then even more random was my running into the work of the cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker. And this was on another shelf in the library. I wish I could say something more intellectually compelling, but the truth is that one of his books, The Birth and Death of Meaning, had interesting green splotches on a white background, and I was like, "Ooh, look at those colored dots!" And so I grabbed the book, The Birth and Death of Meaning, and in the very first paragraph, this book was written originally in the 1960s, and then he wrote a second edition, I believe, in 1972 or so. And anyway, in the first paragraph of the book, Becker says, "Here, I'm interested in why people behave the way that they do." And I was like, yeah, me too. Why do people behave the way that they do? And then I found his prose engaging and accessible. And I found it to be a very interesting juxtaposition of like psychoanalytic thought with some very interesting evolutionary assertions. And what I realized was that Becker had a profoundly interesting and I thought compelling way of describing the motivational underpinnings of human behavior, such that he was able to address both of our questions and to convince us they were essentially the same question.
And was his great insight that our fear of mortality or the ways that we cope with mortality have a lot to do with our behavior and our overall mindset, our psychology?
Yes.
And was this an epiphany for you? Had you encountered it before in any form, or was it really a novel idea to you at that point?
Well, no, for us it was tremendously novel professionally, but not in the least personally, at least for myself, John. And in fact, for Jeff and Tom, later on when I called them up and I said, you have to read this guy, this is quite remarkable. No, our joke is that if you read, and it's not a joke, it's just a claim, is that if you read the traditional academic discourse of the time, you would get the sense that either death is not a problem for human beings or that it really doesn't even exist. And what Becker did was to claim two things. One is that only human beings are aware of, at a rather early age, the inevitability of their own mortality. And that secondly, that is an unwelcome realization that gives rise to potentially paralyzing existential terror. And that almost everything that we do, whether we're aware of it or not, and in fact, the most interesting part of the claim is that we're generally unaware of it, is to obscure that rather unpleasant fact. And so I had two reactions. One was just, wow, this is remarkable in the sense of trying to account for so much of what people do with a relatively simple idea, which is that we try to deny the fact that we will someday die or transcend it somehow. And then the second thing that I realized is that this is something that had been bugging me personally since I was a little kid. I remember being 8 years old and my grandmother died. And I remember my mom saying, "Oh, say goodbye to grandma because she's sick. She's not going to be here much longer." And my grandmother had cancer and they hauled her away to the hospital and she died that evening. And I remember sitting there saying, "Oh, yeah, I'm going to miss grandma." And then I was like, "Oh, yeah, but if she's dying, then my mom's not going to be here forever." And I was like, "Oh, man, that's a downer. You know, who's going to make me spaghetti and chocolate pudding?" And I didn't care for that. But then I was like, "Oh, wow. And if she's going to die someday, then I'm going to be on deck." And I just remember that sending a proverbial and real chill down my spine. And I've not been a big fan of the prospect of my own demise for as long as I can remember. And so for me, Becker really was an epiphany. It reminded me that I had personal concerns about my own mortality that were relatively long-standing. And then I was like, geez, this guy has very provocative answers to the questions that Jeff and I were posing. And so I called these guys up. This is back in the days of phone, you know, before email and stuff. And I was like, geez, we got to look at this guy. I think he's got a lot to say.
Um, that's great. I was actually going to ask you if you could remember the moment in your childhood when you first became aware of death. For me, it was when I was in first grade, and but my teacher came in front of the class, and she was obviously really upset. I think she'd been crying. All of us could see that, and then she told us that one of our classmates, who had been missing for a couple of days, had just died
Oh,
of some
wow.
infection, and it just shocked me. And I went through the same process that you were just describing, where I suddenly realized that everybody around me was going to die, and gulp, I
Yeah.
was going to
That's
die as well. And I couldn't believe that everybody around me wasn't totally obsessed with this all the time and talking about it constantly because it was so shocking and horrible.
no, absolutely. That's right.
Yeah, just going back to for a second. So Freud had the death instinct, thanatos. Have you found anything useful in Freud when it comes to describing the psychology of our confrontation with mortality?
Oh, for the most part, no. And I mean that with the utmost of respect. I think what we got from Freud was a reinforcement of the idea that motivation is important. We also got from Freud the idea that much of what happens in all of our lives is not accessible to conscious introspection, or this idea of the dynamic unconscious. And then finally, what we got from Freud, well, two things. We got the idea that, it's okay to change your mind in light of the facts. And so Freud changed his mind quite a bit over the course of his life. And then finally, and in fairness to Freud, by the end of his life, when he's writing like The Civilization and Its Discontents and The Future of an Illusion, unbeknownst to himself even, Freud is becoming more devoted to an existential point of view. We never took very seriously the idea of a death instinct where he claimed that we secretly want to die. Rather, we adopt and accept Ernest Becker's position in The Denial of Death, which is that Freud, being quite human himself, was also terrified of his own mortality and went to great lengths to avoid thinking about the implications of that fact for his own psychological theorizing. So there are places in Freud's writing where he just says that death is the ultimate threat. But from the perspective of his id psychology, he just said, well, in the id, there's no such thing as dying, that none of us can fathom the prospect of our own non-existence. And I think that's as far as he got. And what Ernest Becker did was to start with Freud's musings about death and to kind of turn the death instinct on its head. It's not that we want to die, it's rather that we desperately are disinclined to die. That is what motivates us for the most part in terms of what we do every day.
It just occurs to me in thinking about the worldviews of some of these great influential thinkers that they cannot help but be influenced by the events unfolding around them. And so I would imagine, I think, my recollection is that Freud first conceived the death instinct idea either during or shortly after World War I, and was trying to make sense of this this giant cataclysm where millions of people seem to be rushing eagerly off to their death.
Yes.
So, yeah, but okay. So the Thanatos idea, that you haven't seen any evidence for that. But so tell me where the terror management idea first came from.
Sure. So, we start reading Becker's books, and we're like, wow. He's saying some things that we found fairly potent, and specifically that human beings are uniquely aware of the inevitability of death, and that unwelcome fact gives rise to potentially debilitating existential terror, and that what human beings do in order to minimize or eliminate that terror is to embed themselves in what he called cultural worldviews, humanly constructed beliefs about the nature of reality that we share with our fellow human beings, that give us a sense that life has meaning and that we have value. And what Becker said is that when people think that they're valuable members of a meaningful universe, that's what he calls self-esteem. And he argues that the primary function of self-esteem is to minimize anxiety in general and about death in particular. And so our idea, we call this notion terror management. At the time, it was just a playful jab at the impression management people. Remember minutes ago when I said, oh yeah, the prevailing explanation why people need self-esteem is to manage how other people feel about them. And so we were just kind of playfully saying, no, the main reason that we need self-esteem is to manage our own existential terror. And so that's basically what terror management theory posits, is that in order to manage existential terror, people embrace cultural worldviews and strive for self-esteem. And that because it's so important to minimize existential anxieties, that's what we spend a lot of our time and energy doing, whether we're aware of it or not, is maintaining confidence in our culturally constructed beliefs and faith in our value as individuals who are worthy of self-regard. And that, moreover, anytime we existential concerns are aroused, we will go to great lengths to bolster our confidence in our cultural worldview and to strive to fortify self-esteem. And so that's basically terror management theory. And it's from that that we address this other question. Well, why is it that we can't get along with people that are different than ourselves? And here what Becker pointed out was two things. One is that, well, if your beliefs about reality serve a death-denying function, then whenever you encounter somebody who has different beliefs, this is a problem psychodynamically, whether you're aware of it or not, because if you accept the validity of an alternative conception of reality, you undermine the confidence with which you subscribe to your own, and in so doing, basically undermine your own existential anxiety buffer. And then the other problem that Becker raised in a book called Escape from Evil was an idea that I think he actually got from William James, and that is that our religions, our economic institutions, our political institutions are all very powerful culturally constructed symbols that help us ward off death anxiety, but they're nevertheless still symbolic, whereas death is a very real physical event. And so what Becker hypothesized is that whether we're aware of it or not, no symbol is powerful enough to completely eradicate death anxiety. So we call that residual death anxiety. And what Becker said in his lovely language is that there's always going to be a rumbling of panic beneath the surface of consciousness in the form of residual death anxiety. And then he goes all psychodynamic and he says what happens is we repress that death anxiety and project it onto other individuals or groups of individuals that we designate as like the all-encompassing repositories of evil. And so what Becker then says is, well, so when we run into people who are different, or when we declare people to be evil incarnate, like the communists back in the day, or Islamic folks today in some quarters, well, what we do, first of all, is to disparage or derogate them. So I may believe that God created the earth in 6 days before taking a well-deserved break, but the Borneo and South Pacific, they believe that the earth was gestated out of a giant coconut. All right, but if they're right, then we must be wrong. All right, but then again, the Borneo and the South Pacific, are wearing skirts and living in tents and worshiping piles of sticks and mud. And so obviously those poor bastards don't have access to the truth. Now, I know I'm being silly here, but my point is that by disparaging the possessors of alternative conceptions of reality, it's easier to maintain confidence in one's own.
Right.
And simultaneously, we try to get people who are different to drop their ideas and to adopt ours instead. Like Christian missionaries are a good example, but political proselytizers do the same thing. And then finally, if that doesn't work, just kill those people, and thus proving that your God and your ideas are superior after all. And so from a terror management perspective, following Becker, the way he says it in Escape from Evil is that, ironically, most of the evil in the world is caused by people trying to rid the world of evil because they're fundamentally intolerant of people who don't share their death-denying vision of reality.
I don't know if you know the work of Robert Wright. He's the guy who actually created Meaning of Life TV and
Oh, I'm a big fan.
And Blogging Heads TV. All right, so he has helped to spread the evolutionary psychology framework for understanding the mind and human behavior and so forth. And I'm just curious, is I've always thought it was interesting that evolutionary psychology and psychoanalysis put sex/reproduction at the heart of the human psyche. And what's fascinating to me about terror management and the work of Becker is that it says there is something um, as at least as powerful that motivates us and that can help us understand both individual behavior and behavior right up to the global level. And I just wonder, is there anybody in evolutionary psychology today, or is there any tradition within, I don't know, sociobiology for trying to incorporate our attitudes toward death into their psychology?
Yeah, that's a great question. Now, um, and here it gets globby because I do think what's interesting is that the evolutionary psychologists, not all of them, but generally, they have nothing but unmitigated scorn for the psychoanalysts who they saw as just speculative lunatics. And yet, the psychoanalysts, they saw themselves as working within an evolutionary framework.
Mm-hmm.
And so Geza Roheim, who was one of Freud's disciples and studied different cultures, he said, "Oh yeah, of course we're sexual animals, and of course sexual impulses affect the way that people behave, but we're also self-conscious animals who, by virtue of that fact, can not only reflect on the past but anticipate the future." And this brings the problem of death to mind, and that our ancestors would literally have expired from anxiety or despair if they didn't come up with some way of managing that existential terror. And so, from our point of view, there's no reason why the problem of death could not have arisen in an evolutionary context, and there's no reason why it could not have exerted selection pressures on various responses to it. But the only evolutionary folks that I'm aware of that have written extensively about how concerns about mortality may have influenced the evolution of our species are Ajit Varkey and Danny Brower, who wrote a book a few years ago called Denial. And I'm kind of turning around. I'll be right back with you, John. But I'm gonna flash this for the camera.
Okay.
It's called Denial, Self-Deception, False Beliefs, and the Origins of the Human Mind. And I think this is a wonderful book. And to be silly but not, it's when people, evolutionary folks, and they're all very good people, and I'm good friends with some of them, they're like, "Oh, you guys are full of crap. You don't know anything about evolutionary theory, and there's no way that concerns about mortality could have influenced the evolutionary trajectory of humankind." My response is, well, all right. Don't read us then. Read Varkey and Brower, a microbiologist, and Brower is deceased, but he was a geneticist. And they make the same argument that Becker does and that we do, and that is that there came a point in the history of humankind where burgeoning self-awareness, which is typically highly adaptive, brought the issue of death to mind. And that full-blown consciousness, which is considered a hallmark of our humanity, and is known to be very handy, both in terms of managing our interactions with our fellow human beings and enabling us to imagine things that don't yet exist, and then have the audacity to make them real, that kind of consciousness could never have been a viable form of mental organization unless there were concurrent adaptations to render us comfortable with the fact that we someday die in the form of cultural worldviews and supernatural constructs that offer some hope of immortality, either literally or symbolically, to their adherents.
Well, I think you could just point to the origins of religion and the universality of ideas about an afterlife. as evidence of how important your your um, your theory of how important our attitudes toward death are. Is there any? Do you happen to know when I don't know, burial rituals show up in the archaeological record? I seem to recall doing a little piece for Scientific American back in the late '80s on the discovery of Neanderthal graves where there were trinkets and various things that were placed along with the body in graves that obviously seemed to indicate that there was some belief in an afterlife and reverence toward the dead and so forth.
Well, that's my understanding, although it's quite controversial because most folks, and I'm not expert in this area, dispute that the Neanderthals were in the least concerned about the thereafter. Ian Tattersall, I think, at the Natural History Museum, offers some alternative accounts that I don't find particularly convincing. But be that as it may, I think that at least going back 30 or so thousand years ago in the so-called, the Cultural Big Bang, where we supposedly made the leap from Homo sapiens to Homo sapiens sapien, what folks argue is that three things happen simultaneously: the universal presence of burials with grave goods, body ornamentation, and art that had a clear symbolic content. And our view is that that's not coincidental, that those are simultaneous manifestations of a yearning to transcend our mortality.
So, at what point? So you and your buddies, you suddenly discovered this literature that helped to make sense of some of the things that you were interested in. At what point did you start doing all the studies that you've described both in your most recent book and previously?
Yeah, good. That was 3 or 4 years later, John, because what happened is we ran into Ernest Becker's ideas around 1980 or 1981. We spent a few years just reading the books to get more thoroughly acquainted with what he was saying. And then in 1984, I gave the first public presentation of terror management theory at the Society of Experimental Social Psychology meeting in Snowbird, Utah. And there were like 200, most of them very famous social psychologists there at the time. And so I started talking and I said, "Oh, we have a theory." And then people started getting up and walking out of the room because theories were not even in vogue in those days. And then I said, "Oh, it's an interdisciplinary theory. And it's based on some ideas of Freud and Soren Kierkegaard and Karl Marx." All right, another wave of people fleeing the room. And then we started talking about Becker and Otto Rank and the denial of death. And so we had about 200 people to start, and maybe 30 or 40 people literally by the time I finished. And Jeff was there at the time. Tom was elsewhere, and he said, "Oh, I don't think they liked it very much." And I was like, "No, they loved it. They were just running out of the room to get the paper that we've not yet written describing these ideas." And so then we wrote a paper that we submitted in 1985 or so to the American Psychologist. And as we write about in our book, a few months later, it was rejected, and one of the reviews was particularly pithy. It was a single sentence, and the reviewer said, "I have no doubt that these ideas are of no interest whatsoever to any psychologist, alive or dead." And so Jeff and Tom are like, "Oh, I don't think they like it." And of course, I'm being silly and stupid, and I'm like, "No, they love it. They're just being coy." And but they weren't, because we sent the same paper to just about every psychology journal, and it was rejected by all of them until we happened to be at a conference where Leonard Aron who was the editor of the American Psychologist at the time, he said to us, look, these ideas are interesting, but you will not get anywhere in academic psychology until you provide some empirical support for them. And I know this sounds silly, but we didn't ever think about that. We just thought these ideas were so poignantly self-evident that we didn't have to bother. And that's probably to our discredit, because then we're like, oh man, we have PhDs in experimental social psychology, which I had always disparaged somewhat as being a method in search of a question. But here we finally had some good questions. And so I think around 1986 or so, we started doing experiments, and there were basically two categories of them. One is fairly straightforward, and that was to demonstrate that self-esteem buffers anxiety. And we did a series of studies. They're fairly simple, but I do believe they're fairly compelling, where we manipulated self-esteem, either raised it momentarily by giving people pleasant, although contrived feedback about their personality or their intelligence, and then exposing them to a threatening situation, maybe watching a movie about an autopsy or an electrocution, or more directly threatening them by telling them they were about to receive painful electrical shocks. And what we found was that when people's self-esteem was momentarily elevated, they reported being less anxious, and perhaps more importantly, when we measured autonomic arousal, sympathetic nervous system arousal in the form of skin conductance, they were actually less aroused, anticipating threats when their self-esteem had been elevated. And there's now been dozens of studies showing that self-esteem really does have a potent effect of reducing anxiety, just as Becker and terror management theory had claimed. All right, and then the other branch of the research, and this was tougher because we didn't really know how we were going to get at the issue of demonstrating that people's beliefs about reality serve a death-denying function. And we were the beneficiaries of an accident of sorts. And I think this is an important epistemological point, because if you read textbooks, in any science, psychology included, it sounds like, oh, there's this inexorable path to progress, and that you have these questions and it just immediately becomes apparent how you're going to address them. But we're sitting around going, we have no idea how we're going to figure this out. And then we were lucky, because one of the graduate students, Jeff's graduate students at the University of Arizona, was in a death and dying class. And she came in one day and she's like, wow, in the death and dying class, they're asking us to write our own obituary. And in order to come to terms with our own mortality. And in order to help us do that, they gave us these little questions. Please describe the thoughts and feelings that your own death arouse in you. And please describe as best you can what you might be thinking and feeling at the moment that you physically die. And we saw that and we're like, wow, this is perfect. Why don't we have some people answer those questions, which should bring their own mortality momentarily to mind, and then let's have other people answer parallel questions about something either innocuous, like watching television, or something unpleasant, but not fatal, like having a root canal or being in a car accident and losing a limb or something along those lines. And what we reasoned is that if Becker and terror management theory are correct, when you're reminded of your own mortality, that should make you cling more tenaciously to your culturally constructed beliefs. And we should be able to detect that by your reaction to other individuals who either share those beliefs or who deviate from them. And so, for example, in one of the first studies that we did at the University of Arizona, we had Christian participants either think about their own mortality or something unpleasant, and then we had them rate other people in the room who were very similar to each other, except some were believed to be Christian and some were believed to be Jewish. And what we found is that under control conditions, the Christian participants didn't respond differently. They didn't evaluate the targets differentially as a function of their religion. However, when they were reminded of their mortality, now it was very different. Now they liked fellow Christians a lot more, and they had quite negative evaluations of the Jewish targets. And of course, this has nothing to do with Christianity per se. I mean, my silly joke is that we used Christian participants in that study because the 5 Jewish people in Arizona were busy that day. All right, but over in Israel, when Jewish people are reminded of their mortality, they like fellow Jews more, and they dislike Arabs and Christians. And this is a robust phenomenon that has been found around the world by independent researchers, and that is that reminders of mortality increase our affection for people who are similar, and they decrease our affection, or to put it more positively, they increase our hostility and disdain to people who are different. And we now know that death reminders not only change one's attitudes, they also change one's behavior. So Germans reminded of death sit closer to fellow Germans and further away from people who appear to be foreigners. And people that are reminded of death, or who are reminded of death rather, who are given an opportunity to physically harm other individuals who don't share their beliefs, will take advantage of that opportunity.
It's really a remarkable discovery, and it obviously has such broad implications. Would you say it's fairly that you've overcome some of that initial skepticism that you encountered?
Yes, I think so. And in fairness, and as you know, as in your pursuits as a very fine science writer, I mean, skepticism is part and parcel of science. Science gets nowhere if everybody agrees. And that skepticism is the motivational prod for inquiry. And so I'd say there's been 3 waves of reactions. There were some folks who in the late 1980s, when we started producing empirical evidence, said, oh, wow, you guys are on the right track. I think this evidence is quite compelling. There were other folks who said, I still don't believe it. And even though this is sad, it was the unfortunate events of the September 11th, 2001, the attacks on the Pentagon and the World Trade Center, where we were asked to write a book. In October of 2001, the American Psychological Association said, oh, we want you to write a book. Could you please explain why this happened, how Americans are apt to respond, and how can we ensure that this doesn't happen again? And by the way, we need you to write this book in 3 months. And we're like, oh man, we don't know anything about terrorism. We're happy to speculate based on terror management theory. But we did our best, and we wrote, I think, a decent book in its time, where we just hypothesized that, from the perspective of Osama bin Laden and like-minded compatriots, that America and the West was the all-encompassing repository of evil, much along the lines of what I talked about earlier, about how you create evil by claiming to rid the world of evil. And if you read like Osama bin Laden's declaration of war, his fatwa against the West, it seems to read very much like something that one would write if you were trying to parody how Ernest Becker and terror management theory would explain these phenomena. And then we proposed that, and this is indeed what happened, that Americans would respond in a variety of ways, and that many of them would be quite heroic and quite ecumenical. For a couple of weeks after 2001, Americans were, blood banks were overflowing, food banks, everyone was helpful and charitable. But at the same time, there was a very rabid and virulent form of patriotism that manifested itself as anti-Islamic sentiment. And it didn't take very long before the first person killed in the aftermath of 9/11 was a Sikh gas station owner in Arizona because he happened to be wearing a turban. And so what happened, to get back to your question, John, was that a lot of other psychologists said, oh, I didn't really believe you guys, but then I saw all of these things that happened after September 11th, and I was like, all right, I guess that you guys have something to say. All right, and then there was a third wave because it took us, I'd say, literally 10 years to understand what was happening in terms of the cognitive mechanisms that underlie these effects. And so we had done a bunch of studies where we showed that if you remind people that they will someday die, that they dislike people who are different. And what a lot of psychologists said, and they were probably right, is, oh, that's interesting, but that's a cocktail party phenomenon until you can explain in a very detailed and accurate way what's happening from the point that you remind people that they will someday die and when they then report not liking folks who are different. And I'll spare you the details, but it took a decade to figure this out. And what we learned is that once people are reminded that they will someday die, that instigates a process that starts with trying to actively suppress conscious thoughts of death, to blot them out of awareness, and that it takes literally mental energy in order to pull that off. And so once we get the thoughts of death out of consciousness and that suppression is relaxed, then you have these non-conscious death thoughts that begin to bubble up and threaten to become conscious again. And that the defensive reactions that we see in the form of denigrating people that are different are ultimately in the service of keeping those non-conscious death thoughts from becoming conscious. And we showed that all of these things happen in a predictable fashion that unfolds over time. And when we did that, there was yet another boatload of psychologists who said, okay, now I'm on board because like evolutionary psychologists demand all the time, they're saying, yo, you can't just have a black box. You have to describe the underlying mechanics of what's happening. And so not everybody agrees with us, and that's as it should be, but I would say that we have vaulted from kind of laughable outcasts to mainstream psychologists who don't garner unanimous agreement by any stretch of the imagination, but I think we've earned a seat at the proverbial table of academic psychology at this point.
Well, I'm really glad to hear that because, as I said, I think your idea is intuitively very powerful, but then, yeah, you've done, in your book, you cite this figure of 500 studies that seem to support it in one way or another. Yeah, we only have 10 minutes left, and I'm just curious. I wanted to ask you about how you personally have reacted over the decades to being engaged in this kind of work. You're obviously thinking about death all the time for professional reasons. Um, how do you cope with it? Let me just start by asking you, are you religious or do you believe in God?
No, I don't think so. Although I believe in the awesomeness and that there's something ineffably alluring about life. But I don't. I would not describe myself as having any religious beliefs per se.
Do you believe in an afterlife?
No, I want to, but I'm kind of stuck with the Woody Allen thing. Is that I want to be immortal by not dying in the first place.
Right. Well, let me also ask you, I think we're roughly the same age. I graduated from high school in 1971. I just turned 62 last week.
Yeah, I'm a little bit behind you. I'm 61 and 62 in 6 months. So yeah, we're of the same cohort.
All right. So, psychedelics, meditation, did you get caught up in some of the stuff that many people in our generation were doing? And did you have any experiences of, I don't know, unity with the universe that might allay your fears of death somewhat?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like many of the folks of the time, I smoked as much pot as Bob Marley. I gobbled hallucinogens indiscriminately. And by the way, I take those experiences quite seriously. This is nothing to be proud of, but I took a course in college on psychoactive drugs, and we deviated a bit from the syllabus by trying each substance while we were studying it. I don't remember doing well in that class, but I've read a lot of the work, the Aldous Huxley and Doors of Perception. There's another guy, Stanislav Grof, who writes about LSD.
Hmm.
And they write about this idea that there is a state that can be attained with the use of those substances. And that's the same, I'm told, as meditation. Where you get to partake metaphorically of eternity, because you get to this state where time momentarily ceases to exist. So I love Aldous Huxley in Doors of Perception when he's gobbling like an elephant dose of mescaline, and he's sitting there, and after a few hours they ask him about time, and his response is that there appears to be plenty of it. And so, we write about in the book, not profoundly, but we mention it in passing, that one, certainly not the only impetus for humankind's affection for altered states, is that it is a momentary respite from the tyranny of time and space.
Do you have, what about the issue of being constantly immersed in in thinking about mortality?
Yeah.
Has it
Well,
had? I mean, is it a positive experience overall for you? Is it a way of helping you grapple with this, or does it make it worse sometimes?
no, I thought, well, all right. So Tom and Jeff and I wish they were here to affirm or disagree, but we've always said, and this may sound counterintuitive, that terror management theory is our terror management defense mechanism, because intellectualizing these ideas spares us the potential pain of actually pondering the implications of them for ourselves. And I don't know if that made sense. Does that
Yeah,
make sense?
it absolutely does. I've sometimes said that the way that life is meaningful for me is that I get to think about and write about the meaninglessness of life.
Yeah, there you go. And I think that's what, so in that sense, and all that proves is that we're people too. And, we go to great lengths. It doesn't make us better people, but to not cast ourselves as exceptions to the general rule that we're all death denying creatures of sorts. But, to be honest, I hope that I have gotten not only older but a bit wiser and more mature over the years. I still am not a particularly big fan of dying, but when I look back and I think about, well, all right, what are the things that have rendered my life meaningful? Well, all right, I do like my work, and at times I'd like to think that it's interesting and maybe even potentially important. But what I've learned from thinking about the transience of life, and this may sound trite to the point of cliche, but I've tried to appreciate the things that perhaps matter most. My friends and my family, and that I play guitar really terribly, but I still like it. And those are the things that sustain me. And right now in our work, Tom and Jeff and I, we're kind of in our own way sick of thinking about death, and now we want to think about life. And we're trying to think about the philosophical and religious traditions that argue unanimously that we need to spend concerted time thinking about our own mortality, because that's different than the fleeting intimations of mortality in our studies that bring out the worst in us. I like Albert Camus in his notebooks when he said, "Come to terms with death. Thereafter, anything is possible." And that may be, an exaggeration, but I think that generally to be true. I think most of us get so immersed in our lives without realizing how much we're cultural caricatures. And we run the risk of, just really, spending too much time, perseverating about the past, apprehensive about the future. And when we do that, pissing away the only thing that truly matters, and that's the present moment.
God, we should just end right there, but I
Yeah, maybe
just
so.
because that was awesome. I'm just going to ask you one other question just because it's something I've been thinking about recently, and Brian can feel free to chop this off. I just came from a conference of environmentalists who are actually sort of iconoclasts who challenge uh, some tenets of traditional environmentalism. But these are all people who are worried about the future of humanity and whether climate change is going to get us. You and I, of course, grew up in a period when it was nuclear war that might
Right.
wipe out humanity. And so one of the questions that environmentalists are grappling with nowadays is whether to try to motivate people to, I don't know, to give a damn about climate change and the environment by scaring the hell out of them,
Yeah, that won't work.
or by giving them hope. It's a question of what kind of rhetoric. So,
Uh,
all right. So I guess you just answered my question.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, we're starting to do some work, and so are other folks. There's a group at the University of Waterloo in Canada that I'll be joining in August, where they're trying to think about approaches to favorable interventions that might work in light of terror management theory. And no, I don't think it will work to just scare the crap out of people. In fact, there's some studies that come out of Europe, I believe, where they looked at the warnings on cigarette packs, where they have like skulls and death images,
Hmm.
and smokers that see those warnings, they report being more interested in smoking because it minimizes the death anxiety the warnings arouse. And so, even if it's true, I don't think the frontal approach to this question will bear fruit. On the other hand, there are some recent studies, and I can send you them if you're interested, that show that when people are told, look, we have to take care of the environment, because if we do so, you're going to leave a legacy that you can be proud of, and appeal to people's concerns for their symbolic immortality. That seems to be more productive and promising as an approach.
I'm going to pass that on to some people I know who are taking the let's scare the shit out of people approach.
Yeah,
In
please
part
do.
because they're actually profoundly depressed and angry about what's been happening or not happening lately. So it's important to have some empirical evidence for these approaches.
That's right, agreed.
Um, all right, that's it.
Thank you,
So
John.
hey, thank you. I really admire your work. And